close your eyes and imagine you're in a hallway. At either end of this hallway, there are doors. You walk up to one of the doors, open it, step through it, and close it behind you. You find yourself in another hallway. It's identical to the one you just left. You notice a piece of chalk on the ground. You pick it up, walk to the door opposite the one you entered by, and draw an eye on the door. You then open the door, walk through it, and close it behind you. You find yourself in another hallway. Again, it's identical to the one you just left. It's complete with the eye on the door opposite the one you entered by that you just drew on the door behind you. Please keep this in mind and open your eyes. We're going to come back to that thought experiment a little later. Right now, I'd like you to think about how you normally perceive things. Normally, when you perceive something, you are the subject and you perceive an object. Right now, you, the subjects of your perception, are perceiving this presentation, the object of your perception. But when we talk about self-perception, things get a little complicated. The subject and the object of perception are the same. The instrument with which you are perceiving is the same thing as that which is being perceived. You can think about just how problematic this gets by trying to look at your eye. It's a little difficult. But you know what your eyes look like. You've seen them before many times. You know what color they are and what shape they are. You do so by engaging in an act of reflection. You look at a mirror. In this way, you change what the subject and the object are. You become the subject, and the object is the reflection of yourself. Another way to think of this is that this loop of subject and object perception is a system. And it's very difficult to untangle the parts of that system. But it's possible to make statements about that system. In this instance, when you're looking at your eye in a mirror, you can't possibly perceive the mirror. You just perceive your eye. But if you step back from that situation, you can perceive the mirror. You can make a statement about the mirror. You know what size it is. You know how far away from it you're standing. Now, this is relatively simple when we're talking about physical perception. You can just go to a physical mirror to see your own eye. But what about when we talk about identity? When we talk about who you really are, what your essence is? How can you examine that? You require a tool of reflection. Shakespeare has said that theater is to hold, as it were, the mirror up to nature, to show virtue her feature and scorn her own image. Theater is the act of reflection we can use to examine ourselves. When you, as an audience, engage in a piece of theater, you put yourselves in the character's shoes. You think, what would I do in that situation? And you relate those characters' experiences to your own experiences. For my Keystone project, I created a play that examined this relationship and also dealt with some of my own interests, including mathematics and philosophy of self. The play is called Nerves of the Heart, and the plot basically is about two scientists who fall in love with the same woman. They decide that in order to determine which of them deserves this woman more, they will create representations of her, and whichever representation is more accurate will win her hand. These are just a few images from that production. Let's go back to the hallway that you just experienced at the beginning of this presentation. Imagine that the yellow square is a piece of paper. On it, I've drawn a stick man. This stick man would like to escape this piece of paper, but he's two-dimensional. When he exits off one side of the piece of paper, he comes back on the other side. If you've ever played Pac-Man, you know how this works. This must mean something about this piece of paper, though. This must mean that this side of the paper and this side of the paper and this, it's just going back to the same place, and that side of the paper are actually the same line. Both those red lines must be the same line. Well, if it's a piece of paper, I can solve this problem easily. I can glue the paper together by folding it, and then I can end up with a cylinder. Now remember, the stick man is two-dimensional. He doesn't have an understanding of the third dimension. So for him, the paper, he doesn't really perceive it as a cylinder. But the stick man has another problem. If he tries to escape by going upwards, he simply re-enters the bottom of the paper. So the top and the bottom of the piece of paper are also the same. Again, I can solve this problem by folding the piece of paper. This time I'm going to fold it inwards and create this shape. This is a torus. The straight line represents the first fold in the paper that I made, and the line around the center is the second fold, where I glued the paper together. Now, if this stick man, imagine the red line is a door. If this stick man walks along a piece of paper, he will end up back at the other side of the same door. This is what was happening to you in the thought experiment at the beginning of this presentation. But let's look at his line of sight as well. Well, he's two-dimensional, so his line of sight is trapped in the plane of the piece of paper. So, his line of sight travels the same way he travels. It travels out one side of the piece of paper and back in the other side. Now, I'm going to get rid of the door in his torus and in your hallway. What would he see then? What would you see then? Well, again, your line of sight travels forward and back in the way you would. So, you would see the back of your head. You would seem to be perceiving a copy of yourself. If you walked through the hallway, you would seem to be following yourself. And this would happen no matter what way you looked. This is a tangled hierarchy. A hierarchy is simply a succession of steps that build on one another. A tangled hierarchy happens when the top of that step, the top step, is actually the same as the first step. Another example of this is M.C. Escher's drawing hands. The first step of the hierarchy is a sketch. It progresses to a physical hand, but then somehow ends back up at a sketch. You can see how this hierarchy would create some kind of loop. This is the first representation that the scientist creates in my play. This is the first representation of a self. Now, we can also think of this as a way of thinking about ourselves. We intake information from the outside world, we interpret that information, and we use that information to generate stories about ourselves. That sense of identity, that sense of self, then impacts how, when, and why we intake information. So, the torus example, the hallway that you were in, is a physical manifestation of this idea of self. But let's go back to that system. So this loop, this tangled hierarchy, is the system of self. And we talked about before that one of the best ways to think about yourself is to make statements about that system. What's the simplest statement you could make about a system? Well, you could copy that system. You could create another system and compare it to the system that is yourself, and simply say, these systems are the same. And while I have trouble examining this system is easy to examine because it's not part of me. That's what the other scientist in my play does. He creates a copy, an identical copy. I know the actress is not totally identical, but what you gonna do? So he creates a copy of the main character. But this has another problem. Think about the person who knows you best out of anyone else in the world. Could they create an accurate copy of you? Set aside your physical being completely. Could they create an accurate copy of your soul or your essence or your sense of identity? Maybe, but probably not. They would probably miss something. Speaking of copies, normally, when you engage in a piece of theater, you see it in proscenium arch. This means that, like in this situation, the audience is separate from the action, and the action occurs like a moving picture on a stage. I wanted to change this, so I set my play in corridor. This meant that there was audience on either side, and the action took place down the middle of the stage. So, as an audience member, when you watched my play, you also looked through the action of the play to a copy of the audience. You yourself were reflected back while you were watching this piece of theater. How does creativity lead to understanding? And I came into this interested in disseminating academic ideas in a creative way. What I realized was that I was much more interested in how creativity can lead to an understanding of the self. How we can take statements about that system and make them as accurate as possible and as insightful as possible so we can better understand the system that is self. Throughout this process, I also realized that in creating this piece of theater, I wasn't just creating something to make you think about reflection. I was creating a reflection of myself. And while I hope that you gained some reflection from seeing this piece of theater, or I hope you did if you saw it, the reflection I gained, I think, was a little bit deeper, because I spent so much time with it. But we've seen a lot of presentations over the past couple days, and they've all been about gaining understanding of the world around us. But I'd like to think perhaps equally as important as gaining understanding of the world is that of attempting to understand the understanders. Thank you.